everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, these folks got it. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
All right, there we go. My name is Dr. Joyce Esther, and I serve as the president, and I'm so excited to be here, especially because English faculty actually gave me a script. No one ever gives me a script. They just tell me to talk, so I'm going to read my script. So I am so happy to welcome you here to the Write Like Us event, the Literary Career Symposium, generously co-sponsored by our friends at Thomson Reuters, and featuring panelists Carmen Gimenez, Arleta Little, who could not be here, I was told, Halee Kirkwood, Bao Phi, and moderator Michael Kleber-Diggs. Again, my name is Joyce, and a visual description of myself: Black woman, long locks, red glasses, and red dress. So thank you for being here. Write Like Us is a collaborative project between the 5 metro area community colleges: Anoka-Ramsey Community College, Century College, Minneapolis College, Normandale Community College, and North Hennepin Community College. In addition to bringing you events like this featuring nationally prominent writers of color, the Write Like Us project coordinates a mentorship program, pairing community college student writers with respected writers of color from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Now in its second year, the Write Like Us project succeeding in improving equity and opportunities for student writers and providing opportunities for the public to engage with writers whose work expands our perspectives. We are delighted to bring you this event today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the major funders for this project: Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, Thomson Reuters, as well as the 5 participating colleges, all of whom have donated time, personnel, and resources to the project. I'd also like to thank the project coordinators and campus stewards who have organized and planned these events, as well as the Write Like Us mentors, whose work with our students has been invaluable. Please join me in thanking all of our sponsors, partners, for their support and participation. Now, before we begin, we have to do some housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones. Remember, there is no flash photography allowed during the presentation. Respect seat marks as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. And please give our guests about 10 minutes after the presentation to get to the meet and greet area outside of the auditorium, where you'll find a nice spread of appetizers and beverages and desserts to enjoy. This event is live captioned. Captions will appear on the screen in the auditorium and will be visible to those joining us on the webinar. Thank you, and now it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Write Like Us mentor and today's moderator, Michael Kleber-Diggs, who will introduce the event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to the audience here and the audience online. We're so grateful to have you with us this afternoon. I want to start by just thanking, as the president did, all of the people who make our time together here today possible. Our program coordinators, our campus stewards, our mentors, our students. There's a lot of planning that goes into making an event like this possible. I'd also like to thank our sponsors as well, the Minnesota State Multi-Campus Collaboration and Thomson Reuters. Just by way of background, last year we began conversation in partnership with Thomson Reuters, just talking about possibilities for making an impact in the literary arts. We had this program where we offered mentorship to community college students who were interested in creative writing, and we saw an opportunity to expand that to also consider literary arts as a profession and all the different ways that people can be connected to books and bookmaking, publishing, distribution, book selling, the entire kind of ecosystem of the literary world. And so in partnership with them, we came up with this idea to have a literary symposium. So I want to thank Thomson Reuters for the financial sponsorship, but also for the collaboration and idea making that led us to be here this afternoon. Before we begin, I'd like to also just read a land acknowledgement. To move in solidarity with the indigenous peoples of this land and to name our presence here as settlers or as beneficiaries of settler colonialism, we offer the following land acknowledgement. We recognize that land acknowledgements are their own craft, and it's one that we mentors wrote this together, and it's kind of a new exercise for us, and we're excited for the learning to come. And this is us kind of making our initial attempt. We are gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Lakota, Nakota, Ho-Chunk, and Cheyenne people of what is now known as Minnesota, but what was previously known as Minnesota Makoche, which translates to land where the water reflects the clouds. The original peoples are still here, tending to rich wild rice, to unspoiled forest land, and to other vital plants and herbs. We are all interacting with these gifts every day, whether consciously or unconsciously. They are influencing us. Wild rice, for example, preserves culture and ancient traditions, supports the preservation of natural spaces, shows us better ways of being in relationship with the land, the water, and each other, and feeds hundreds of thousands of people every year. Thinking about all the ways we have migrated, many of us forcibly, through the Atlantic slave trade or imperial wars, not only from our original lands, but from our cultural ways of knowing, of learning from each other and our natural rhythms, we just wanted to take a moment to live and breathe together. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists today. I want to begin by saying our Lita Little, who was planning to be with us, is not able to make it, and so we'll miss her attendance today. I'll share all the bios, and then we'll kind of just get right into the conversation and share some ideas. Carmen Gimenez, in the middle here, is the author of numerous poetry collections, including Milk and Filth, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry, and B. Recorder from Grey Wolf Press in 2019, which was a finalist for the 2019 National Book Award in Poetry, the Penn Open Book Award, the Audre Lorde Award for Lesbian Poetry, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She was awarded the Academy of American Poets Fellowship Prize in 2020. A 2019 Guggenheim Fellow, she served as a publisher of Noemi Press for 20 years, and she is currently the publisher and executive director of Grey Wolf Press here in Minneapolis. Welcome, Carmen. Halee Kirkwood, seated to the right, is a descendant of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and a descendant of a long legacy of public transit riders. A first-generation college student and a proud Upward Bound alumni, Kirkwood graduated from Northland College in 2015 and earned an MFA from Hamline University in 2019. Other honors include a 2019-2020 Loft Mentor Series Fellowship, a 2019 Desert Nights Rising Stars Teaching Fellowship at Arizona State University, and both Pushcart and Best of the Net nominations. Kirkwood is a bookseller at Birchbark Books and currently teaches an Introduction to Publishing course at Hamline University, where they work together with undergraduate students to create Runestone Journal. Let's welcome Halee. I'd like to acknowledge Arleta Little also and her many contributions to our community and her storied career. Arleta Little is a writer and cultural worker and the executive director of the Loft Literary Center. Her literary work has appeared in Blues Vision, African American Writing from Minnesota, and in the St. Paul Almanac. She is co-author along with Josie R. Johnson and Carolyn Holbrook of Hope in the Struggle, a memoir about the life of Josie R. Johnson. She has worked as the executive director of the Givens Foundation for African American Literature and as an arts program officer and director of artist fellowships at the McKnight Foundation. She lives in the Longfellow neighborhood of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm going to read Bao's bio also. It's short, and his accomplishments are many. I wrote and I asked Bao, like, is there a shorter version I could use? And I got like the shortest version, but Bao is a tremendous writer, a tremendous member of our literary community, a slam poet with a number of accolades in that form, and an artist who practices in many areas. Wow. Yes.
Thanks.
This is what he sent. Bao Phi is a spoken word poet with 2 books of poetry published for adults, both by Coffee House Press, and 4 picture books for children, all published by Capstone. He is currently a program officer on the Arts and Culture team at the McKnight Foundation. Halee, Carmen.
Short, factually correct.
Halee, Carmen, and Bao, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm so excited to be in conversation with all of you. I wonder if we could just start by talking about your current roles and the path you traveled to the position you now occupy. Bao, I'll start with you.
Great. It's really good to be here with you all. It's good to be here with you friends. Most of us, we know each other. Hello, internet, streaming land, all of you out there. It's good to be with you too. So very quickly, I currently am a program officer at the McKnight Foundation and the Arts and Culture team. So our team is responsible for allocating $10 million annually to over 150 arts organizations, not to mention artists in Minnesota. So that's what we do. We're grant makers, change makers, however you want to say. Before that, I was at the Loft Literary Center for almost 23 years. I started there as a receptionist a little over 23 years ago. By the time I left, I was director of events and awards. Did not plan that. Since we're talking about careers and stuff like that, I was fresh out of college. I had a full scholarship to Macalester College. I chose to major in English creative writing. That didn't go over well with my parents because, I was the first in a poor refugee family to get a full scholarship to a private liberal arts college. They wanted just one of us to be a doctor. They thought, we waited all this time, it's gonna be the youngest, right? He got a full scholarship in English major. That's what they got. But at that time, I had an English degree and everybody was saying, you need to go get an MFA or a PhD or you're not gonna get a job, or you're not gonna be able to support yourself. What I ended up doing was, after college, I worked in restaurants, I delivered pizza. I did apply to some MFA and PhD programs, nobody wanted me. But around the same time, I was also very active in spoken word and slam. And I was part of this countercultural movement that was just so vibrant and enriching to me. That's another whole long story. I'm telling you all this because my career trajectory was not planned. I was told a lot of things, some of which ended up being true and some of which ended up being not true. And so I guess I'll end this part by saying, what I'm probably gonna say to you may not be true for you either, because we're in a different age right now. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Carmen?
Whoops, okay, here we go. I think there are lots of the commonalities of working against these expectations of you're gonna be an English major, you should be a lawyer, right? Didn't happen, but it's also interesting that people come into your life and change the course of your life. One of my very first English professors was a scholar of poetry named Alden Nielsen. I don't know if any of you know him, but he studied radical Black traditions of poetry. So he immediately set me on this really exciting course. But when I was I think it was when I was a sophomore, I had a professor who said, I do this thing called the Center for Literary Arts, and I wonder if anyone wants to volunteer. We do readings. I was like, oh, I'll try that. And that was the beginning of my career as a literary citizen. And it was the moment in which I think that writers can have lots of different paths, and there's no judgment at all. But what I found that the path that spoke most to me was to be a writer citizen, was to be someone who was paying it forward and making space. And so when I did the work for the Center for Literary Arts, it was beneficial for me because I got to drive Lee Young Lee around and, take Joyce Carol Oates coffee. And Ken Kesey tried to buy pot from my friend. You know what I mean? There's all of these ways in which I was involved in this part of the literary world that showed me, first of all, it humanized it for me. But the other part was that I was in dialogue. And then the final part was that I was helping make space for people to encounter literature. And one of the most striking moments of that part of my life was organizing a Lucille Clifton reading and Lucille Clifton reading, and it's church, right? Like, and just realizing like everyone is captivated. And, I passed out programs, I folded them, I, helped people to their seats. But in one way or another, I was part of making that space. And so immediately I thought, yeah, some way or another, this is what I want to do. I went to San Jose State, so it was a state school, and somehow I got into PTSD MFA called University of Iowa, where where one good thing that came out of it, I think, was there was an exposure to like the idea of print culture. It was the mid 90s, and so people were talking about magazines and looking back at the history of print culture and reminding us that so many of the art movements that existed involved writers, poets, musicians, artists making spaces, and often those spaces were in like literary journals or literary magazines, and that immediately spoke to me. And I'm from California, and so when I went back to the Bay Area, I had it in my head that I wanted to do some kind of work in that way. And again, sort of the peripatetic way that you find your path, I was always like really wanted to mess around with a broadside machine, a printing press. And I had a friend who had one, and I was like, hey, I want to start a chapbook press. Can I make a cover on you? But all I really wanted to do was like play with the machine. And that is how Noemi Press was born. That is not a lie. It was like me just wanting to mess with a machine. And in fact, the name was just sort of like, it was my mom's middle name. I liked the sound of it, and that's how it started. But again, immediately I was hooked. It was making space for writers. And so I kept doing that. I did have a career as an academic, but Noemi Press was, it was a small press. We started with chapbooks. We ended up over time doing about 10 titles a year with no money, all volunteer staff. And it became, in a way, the most important work that I felt I was doing. But I was happy to do it within the confines of academia and having a writing career. And then I guess it was, a couple of years ago, I get an email from Jeff Schatz, and he says, it's verbatim, Carmen, if you or anyone you know is interested in applying for a job, Fiona is retiring and Grey Wolf is looking for a new executive director. And I actually got emotional, first of all, that he would even think like that I could be applying for that job. But then it was also like the tiny portal opened up for me. And so I talked to my family, and I thought, yeah, I'm gonna go for it. And here I am. I started in August, and so I'm in a new chapter. Thank you. And to me, it's just, and again, I have other things to talk about it, but it's just sort of like that little Carmen who was handing out flyers, flyers, or using Quark Express to make a program, is like sort of the same spirit of like making space. How can I use this like Grey Wolf's massive cultural capital to change literature, to change people's lives, to change writers' lives, and to bring a lot of that sort of DIY ethos that built Noemi into this space. So that's, I think that's kind of the broad strokes.
Nice.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, this was an atypical winter.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I got Yak Tracks, so I've got it covered.
Halee.
Yeah, so I would say my life in the literary arts is still actively evolving. I graduated from my MFA in 2019, and there's been a whole pandemic in between, so things are, they're still evolving. But I'll talk about my Birch Bark book selling career that's happening. So when I graduated Hamlin's MFA, and I really needed a job pretty quickly, and I ended up working at Half Price Books in St. Paul, which is a very difficult job. It's very physically draining. You have to buy books from the public, which is its own intense thing to do. People have different ideas of what their used books are worth and all this stuff. But so I was not very happy there, and felt kind of down on my luck, I don't have the energy to write after work, and it's not going very well. But then my friend and fellow native poet, Anthony Sabalos, who went to school here as well, I think. Was he at MCTC or Normandale? MCTC, yeah. One class here. Yes. So dear beloved Anthony, he asked me if I ever would want to work at Birchbark Books, and I absolutely wanted to. It was such a dreamy bookstore, but I was still working at Half Price, and they had health insurance, and they had paid like holiday time. So I was like, oh, I don't know if I can leave Half Price. So then I did this just absolutely horrible thing where I did part-time at both, and so I'd have to work at Half Price, which is in St. Paul, and then Birchbark Books, which is all like across 2 cities. So I was running myself pretty ragged, and I wanted to be at Birchbark because it's such a center of Native literature and literature in general, but it wasn't really working, and I was on the verge of having to just let Birchbark go and go back to Half Price full time. But then the pandemic happened, and they actually Half Price laid off the majority of their employees, which I don't like to say that something good came out of the pandemic, but that was a positive for me because it did kind of force me like, okay, well, then Birchbark, at least it was here. And then, we survived the pandemic as a bookstore. And then as people kind of left, I was asked to be the manager. And then that's kind of short of how it's happened. And now I manage events at Birchbark, which is the joy of my life. It's so fun. You meet so many different writers. You meet people of all sorts. You just have really meaningful experiences. Working in a bookstore as a literary profession is really exciting and worthwhile. Even though, you might think, well, it's a retail job. There are certain bookstores that you'll have a different experience at certain bookstores. I'm not going to recommend anyone to work at a Half Price Books, but find a good local indie and they'll take care of you.
Yeah. Halee, you shared something there that kind of leads me into my next question. You were talking about working at Half Price Books initially, and then at the end of the day, too tired to write. And I know a lot of our students are it's just so real. I also grew up in a home where it was like, go to college and major in these 8 things. And poetry was not on there. So many of our students are pursuing other career paths and also nurturing and cultivating an interest in creative writing at the same time. And I wanted to just ask all 3 of you, Halee, if it's okay, I'll stay with you. How are you maintain an arts practice and full-time work kind of at the same time? If it's okay to share, I know you're a 2023, 2025 Jerome Hill Artist Fellow.
That's going to be pretty pivotal in having more time to write. Yeah, so that's definitely, I did not expect that to happen. So I think my idea of what's possible has really changed. Was that the end of your question?
But how else do you make time for art and also hold down a full-time job?
Yeah. So I think we had this question a lot this past summer. I had a summer-long workshop for workers who worked in the service industry during the pandemic. And so we had this conversation a lot of how do we do it? It's not easy to say, but I think the common thing you think of is write in between your shifts or write, if you're a clerk at a grocery store, between customers. And I had a student that they wrote a poem on an entire receipt roll that they had stolen from Whole Foods, which was absolutely iconic. And then when they read it, they let the roll drop into the audience. It was the coolest thing. But I think that when you're working retail and maybe I don't want to say get in trouble doing this, but there are different moments where you can engage with the materials at your job in a way that's pretty exciting. That can engage with the receipt paper or whatever. If you work at a movie theater, the movie tickets, to try to find some way to incorporate the materials or the conversations or the interactions you have at your full-time job into your practice in a creative way. So that's kind of how I've tried to do it as well. And not supposed to have your phone on the floor, but if I do have it on the floor, I will kind of use my phone note to type something down that happened that was interesting. So that's in the actual job itself. But I usually work part-time. I'll a lot of different part-time things myself. So I kind of try to stagger it. So I'll like, okay, I've got these 3 gigs happening, and then I'll have a couple weeks and I know I can write those weeks, and I'll kind of like stagger my time. Gig economy, is up, it has positives and negatives. It doesn't work for everybody, but that's how I'll kind of try to stagger my time as well.
Carmen, I feel like being the publisher of one of our foremost literary presses is probably a full-time job.
It's a little bit of a full-time job.
Are you able to make art from time to time?
Yes, for sure. I'm also a translator, and so I've been able to do some translation work. But the idea of a writer not having to do gig job is new, right? It's only been in the last 50 or so years that there's this MFA industry complex that employs people and makes it possible for them to have kind of an academic's life. I mean, it's not a lot, we work a lot, but there are more pockets than there are in like a 40-hour week. And so I, like you, I always had 3 jobs, like minimum of 3 jobs. So I think you just kind of learn how to prioritize. But writers have had jobs, multiple jobs, from the beginning of time. So it's not like there's not a way that you can't teach yourself. And so I always think about William Carlos Williams writing poems on the back of a prescription pad, or Charles Dickens, with kids screaming behind him, writing his novels, his serials, because, the bill collector's coming. And so or Roberto Bolaño writing 2666 while he's dying of cancer. If you want it, you can make it happen. There are things that you have to set aside. Like, there are things that you won't be able to do, but what the thing that writing gives you, you can't find 5 hours, you can't find 3 hours. You have to learn how to make an hour work. Yeah. You have to teach yourself how to get 30 minutes, something out of 30 minutes or something out of an hour. And so that's, I think, also part of it is understanding that you're not going to sit like in the movies with your typewriter with like the trees turning, fall and, whatever. Yeah. You're going to be doing it. I mean, when I had kids and I was doing Noemi and I was teaching, I wrote between the hours of like 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. and I was messy the next day, but I was just like, I wrote for 2 hours yesterday. I'm living my best life.
Yeah. Val, what's your experience been like?
Similar. I should also add that I'm a single co-parent as well as having a full-time job and being an artist. What does that mean? I've been told I'm not allowed to call myself a single father because my child is not with me 100% of the time. Basically, I and my former partner try to split time and responsibility of our child between us, but I am by myself. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Raising a kid. So that adds to, obviously, the time crunch. And I actually, similar to you, learned when actually my child was younger, I basically learned if you don't make time for your writing, you're not going to do it. Like, you have to. It's like going to the gym. You either make time for it or you're not going to do it, right? Like, you have to figure out a way. If it's half an hour, if it's an hour, if it's on the treadmill, or if it's like while you're cooking, or like on the back of like a traffic ticket or whatever, right? Like, you basically just, and for everyone it's different. Like, I've talked to writers who do have a really busy life and they're like, I wake up at this time, I have my coffee, I write for 45 minutes, and then I go to the gym and I go to work, and that works for them. That is not how I do things, and that's okay. Yeah. And for other people, they might find different ways even beyond that, right? Like, you might like not write and be dormant for a while, and then you're able to get a grant and go on a retreat or a residency and carve out time that way, Just writing is like any type of activity. It's like we're all busy, we're all like scrambling, right? And you just got to find time or you're not going to do it.
I think the other thing that's important is we're often afraid or don't think that we can ask other people in our lives to help us make space because we don't think, I think the first thing you have to say is like, I'm an artist. And everyone needs to just accept that that's a part of me. It's kind of like coming out. Like, I'm an artist, And this is what defines being an artist, and these are the needs. And it's surprising to think of like how many folks are going to be aware and trying to support you. So I think it's also just naming what your needs are and putting them into the universe. So when someone says, just go work on your poems, I'll wash the dishes, or like, I know you're finishing this essay, so don't worry about it, is also just asking for space.
Think about pace a little bit. I think in our culture, there could be a temptation to, I finished this one and now it's on to the next one, on to the next one. And if you have a busy life and a full-time job and parenting responsibilities and other passions, that might mean that it takes a little bit longer to get the next book completed. Do you ever feel that way or experience that?
Right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have, I'm sorry. So I haven't published a book yet, but I have 2 manuscripts and I'm thinking of the 3rd. So it's very much just kind of like nebulous in between space. But I know the first manuscript was definitely the like, this is where I'm from, this is my family, kind of like who I am manuscript, which like is really important to write, but I think I needed to move away from it as well. So while I'm still trying to get it published, so having a second project to kind of think of while still trying to get that one published has actually been really good for my creative self. Oh, there I am. Okay. Oh, thank you. On and off here. Yeah. Oh,
Sorry, should we share microphones?
I don't know.
Or the handheld maybe?
Oh, okay. Here.
Oh, there we go.
In and oh.
So it's an interesting question. I was a professor in MFA programs for 20 years, and often a student would come in and say, I gotta get published, and so and so just got published in blah 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 magazine, and so I gotta get published. And so to me, that's one path, that's one trajectory, and then the other one is like, I need to change and grow as an artist, and to me, that's the most significant and important part of your pace. I graduated MFA school in 1997. My first book was published in 2009. That means there were 12 years where I was perfecting and improving and refining my craft. And when I was compelled by that hustle, like I got to get into Paris Review and I got to get this magazine or that magazine, the work was never good. Because it wasn't about the work, it was about ego. Right. And so I think like really differentiating like the drive and the pace between what your ego wants and what your art needs, that's what helps me sort of have context. And I think sometimes like, well, it's easy for you to say because you have so many books and all these things have happened. Yeah, I sat 12 years, like 12 years and I was waiting for it to happen, right. And it didn't happen. And I thought maybe this is never going to happen. But what happened to me is in a way that time was a gift because I wasn't under the pressure of trying to fulfill any kind of agenda or anyone trying to shape who I was. And I just had time. And so I kept revising and reinventing and understanding that spending time interrogating who I was helped shape my writing. And so then when I was ready, I was ready. I was ready to go.
Yeah, so similarly, I think I started doing the type of poetry that I do in high school at 16 on speech team. And my first book wasn't published till I was 35, right? So it was a long time gestating. And I'll talk about it's so funny, right? Because in spoken word, what I would do is if I was hired to go do a performance somewhere, I would try to at least challenge myself to have at least 1 or 2 new poems for every gig that I had. And what was fun about that was that it was, it was in the moment, it lived and died with the audience that would choose to come see me. And I could change things on the fly. It was very kind of holistic, right? Once you start talking about publishing, it's a completely different mindset in an animal. It's like suddenly everything feels just nailed down to the page forever. You know what I mean? Like forever. And that was something mentally it was really hard for me to come to grips with, right? And you have to realize this was like before YouTube and Instagram, you know, I sound like an old ass dude. But you know, like, but in the old spoken word and slam days, like you sold chapbooks out of your backpack. You had a hookup at Kinko's, like with a staff member or something. You know, you published your CDs, you sold stuff out of your backpack, you built a mailing list, you know, you toured. But there was like a lovely impermanence to it, right? But once you have a book, it's like, you have a book, you write it, you're like, we talked about this before, you are that person in that moment writing the poems, but the publishing industry, you're not done, right? Like it has to be sold to a publishing house, they have to edit it, you have to edit it, they publish it like 2-3 years later. By that time, you're like, I'm not the same person anymore, I hate this shit. Sometimes, right? And so like, it's a really completely different way of looking at it. But I'm being, nihilistic Gen X. Sometimes though, I mean, I think it's true, but sometimes I will say that sometimes you do come back, you are a different person, but you are able to appreciate, it's like, okay, I grew, that needed to come out and be the art that it was at that time.
Yeah.
And you make peace with it. But it's definitely an adjustment.
Right.
I want to add one thing though, that the advantage that I had was that I was always still involved in literature. And I knew that I didn't have to become a writer or publish a book because I could make space, I could publish books, I could edit, I could translate, I could write reviews. There were all of these ways that I could participate in the ecosystem of literature. Because when you're an editor, the one thing you learn is, and when you think about what your book is your book is a gift. It's a gift to a lineage. It's a conversation to the lineage. And you think about that one person who reads it. I remember when I was at San Jose State University, I remember where I was sitting in the room where I opened up Emplumada by Lorna D. Cervantes, which was the first book, I was like 21 years old, that I have ever read by a Chicana. And it blew my mind. And it was she was from San Jose too, and it was a gift. She wrote that, and it was like she wrote that book for me. Mm-hmm. And that's the book that we all want to be writing, is that it's the book for someone else, not the book for us. And so that sort of that pace and that desire for publishing, really that's the audience who's on the other end of it. They're waiting for you to give them the thing that they need, and sometimes the thing that they need really takes a long time to find.
That's right. Our Write Like Us program, as I shared at the outset, is designed to pair mentors in the community. Ellen Bremer's here, Taiwana Shambly is here, Nicola Ko is here, with creative writing students at area community colleges. And behind that, of course, is the desire for all of the mentees that we work with to see someone who's doing it, and to see national authors come in and established professionals talk about their pathway there. And a big part of it, I think, is the belief that there is a place for you in the world of literature as a writer, as someone whose work is shared and eventually reaches someone who was waiting for that book to kind of help illuminate the path. I'm wondering if you could talk.
Can I add?
Yeah.
Either there's a space for you, or if there's not a space, you have to make it for yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, and part of what I'm thinking about is, what advice would you share with students, with writers who are contemplating a career in literary arts now? And maybe that's connected to that moment for you when you first started to think, I feel like I can do this, or I've found this poetry collection or this novel that makes me say, I want to do that. Like, what advice would you share for someone who's thinking about it?
Great. So I want to go back to something I said earlier. I joked about my parents wanting me to be a doctor, and that's real. But I want to dig deeper into that. Because there's a stereotype that Asian families, they just want you to be doctors and engineers. And to a certain extent, there's truth to that, but people don't dig into it. And one thing that I keep coming back to is people assume Asians are just naturally good at math. No. Asian parents who are immigrants and refugees, they know that racism and discrimination exists. They know, though, that if you go into math and you show your work, there's one correct answer to everything. And if you show it and you have that answer, no one can say you're wrong, right? And I think that there's like a survival mechanism there for immigrants and refugees. It's not that all they care about is being doctors and lawyers. It's like, how am I going to help my children to survive? So I just want to put that out there,
Right.
that I'm not like, engaging in stereotypes against my own people. But to kind of launch off of that, as a writer, right, like coming up, I was also told certain things, that outside the realm of math where there's not one answer. Well, there's no market for Asian American men. Nobody really cares what you have to say. You don't really have anything, to contribute to this discussion of literature, art, American society, whatever. And to a certain extent, some people still believe that, to be honest. I was also told by people who supported me I had to do certain things in order to be successful. And they were well-meaning. But what I kind of discovered is that wasn't the right way for me. In some ways, I felt blocked in those like traditional trajectories. And so I had to find a different way to be successful. Not just a different way to be successful, but how to redefine what success looked like to me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does.
And I didn't do it by myself. I was a part of these really beautiful, conflicted, contradictory, but really wonderful, grassroots spoken word slam movements, built up a lot of times by people and poets from marginalized communities who similarly could not find a traditional path, right? So I guess going back to your question, that was what worked for me at that point in time and for many other people in that point in time.
Yeah.
I think for folks who are thinking about it now, that might not be even the right workaround for you anymore. But then the question is like, what is that workaround? And I don't know what that answer is, right? Like, I think part of it, and I certainly didn't know it back in the day. I didn't say to myself, oh, I'm gonna start doing these poetry slams at Kieran's Irish Pub. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then that's gonna get me onto HBO's Deaf Poetry Jam, and then I'm gonna get all these paid gigs. And I'll start as a receptionist at the Loft, and one day I'm gonna be the boss of this place. Like, I didn't have that plan, I think going back to it is the work was important to me. The poetry work was important to me. Being in community and being part of the discussion was important to me. And then I had to figure out how to live and pay the bills while doing that.
Right.
And it was, I can't give you a map. I can't give you it was just, to a certain extent, I still feel like I'm still grasping at it as it comes.
Right.
That's the most honest answer I can give.
Yeah, thank you.
So when I think about people who are kind of at the same stage as their career and their writing as me, who are really doing, they're building something of their own kind of from scratch. I think of two, they're actually both Dene Navajo writers. One whose name is Amber McCrary, who has started her own press for Indigenous writers called Abalone Mountain Press, and she's published about 4 books now, and they're all fantastic. And she's doing it like from a bookstore in Phoenix, Arizona, just like all on her own. Like she created this thing all on her own, and it's thriving. And then I think of my other friend, Kinsale Drake, who is starting this. She just launched it. It's called Indian Girls Book Club, and it's like a book subscription of like different Native writers, and then she can get donations from it. But then she has them for free for different like young femme youth to have these boxes of like a hat, a couple of books, a notebook, and maybe like they don't have access to that on their reservation. And so there's me, and there's Kinsale, and there's Amber, and through the bookstore, we're kind of trying to help with donations for Indian Girls Book Club, and we're, selling Amber's books that she's publishing. And I think, I have that worry in my head that, oh, is that nepotism? Are we just being like nepotistic, trying to like create, like I'm selling Amber's books and then Kinsale is giving, but that's not, I think especially for like writers of color, publishers of color, anyone who's marginalized in any way, that's not nepotism because there's nothing here of like, we're building it for ourselves and we have to like lift each other up. So I think if you have that like self-doubt that it's nepotistic, it's not, you are building something new.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I talk about Purple Rain for a second? When I remember watching that, and I mean, this stays with me so much, and you may or may not have seen it. I haven't seen it in a long time. I'm a little nervous to watch it again, so I'm just going to leave it in the little Halee. I remember when Apollonia tries to get into the club, and they try to block her, and she puts her shoe in the door. And I remember like that shoe, and I was like, yes.
Yeah.
I was like, that is who I'm going to be. I'm going to be Apollonia. And I mean, seriously, that became a model for me. And I think when you grow up with immigrant parents, like what you watch is a struggle. And you watch someone being, struggle, but also take joy in the struggle. I think sometimes there's that like, this kind of like poverty porn of like, oh, it's also fun. It's fun to kind of find the solutions. It's fun to find like, how do we make this work? How do we find joy out of these limitations? And I think my mom was particularly gifted at showing us joy in whatever circumstance, but also showing us that she was not going to back down. She was going to make space for us and for our lives. And so I took a lot of that in a sense of like, I am not going to be stopped, right? But again, the literary activist part of me was like, and when I'm not stopped, I'm like making a tunnel, and come on, let's go, which is exactly what you're describing. It's not nepotism, it's making space, it's widening the conversation a little bit. But it does mean that you have to be a little bit, you have to learn how to wait tables, you have to learn how to be a bartender, you have to learn how to be a cater waiter, you have to learn how to tutor. You just have to sort of put it all together. Yeah. And it might happen. I'm very lucky. I went to a name brand graduate school, and so I was able to, again, use that cultural capital to build a career for myself. I could have not had that happen. I still would have found my way somehow. It might have looked different, but the drive was always going to be there, the ambition, and also the ability to take the licks and to fail. Because there's 95% of this is failure. Yeah. And it, again, like when you hear our bios, you think that's not true. 100%. I applied for the Guggenheim for 12 years before I got it. 12 seems to be a number. So it's like, you see like the front half of it, but you don't see the back end of it. And I think like that on a micro level, when you read a finished piece of writing, you see the end of a process of revision. We encounter it and we say, gosh, this person is so smart and they're so gifted. No, they were busy. They were revising. They had something as sort of crappy as whatever you think these early drafts of yours were. They just put in the time. But it's also that way with a career that it really takes a really, really long time. And you have to be creative, and you can't hold yourself against what somebody else is doing. That's the poison that destroys people's careers, to be honest.
Yep.
Could I quickly add to that? So a real world example is Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? This movie that came out of nowhere and won all these awards, including like Best Writer, Best Director, right? But Daniel Kwan had talked about, before this movie, they had directed Little John's Turned Down for What video. They had directed this weird movie starring Daniel Radcliffe, Harry Potter as like a farting corpse, right? Like, and they were working on the script, and Daniel Kwan talked about looking at it for years and being like, I cannot do this. Like he was looking at the mess he made, and he was like, this is impossible. Quit. Like, I cannot do this. It's impossible. Like, I have dug myself into a hole, right? And now at the other end of it, I don't want to emphasize too much the award recognition. That's important, but I think what's important is he completed something really different that resonated with a ton of people, right? Yeah. But he thought he was going to fail for years working on it. And I think one thing that's exciting is that there might be someone in this room or watching this stream who's going to come up with a way that we engage with literature that we haven't even imagined yet. And it's going to change everything. And it's going to be wonderful. So don't even think about like, you shouldn't even limit yourself to thinking like, how do I make it in the system that exists now? Think about like, what other possibilities are out there that we haven't even thought about yet?
Right. Yeah. Carmen, you shared earlier about how a career that was connected to books and literature, having your own press, working in academia, working as a translator, allowed a lot. I know, Halee, you're at a bookstore and you're teaching and you're publishing through Hamlin and Bao. You were at the Loft for many years and now you're at McKnight. And in those roles, you had access and connection to arts, to arts makers, to literature, to books. A lot of our mentees are pursuing other degree programs for a lot of reasons. That's their passion. That's the guidance from home. And I don't want to suggest that if you're a computer scientist or a minister, you can't also be a writer. But I would like to spend just a moment thinking about the possible career options that are available in the publishing world and the book ecosystem, because one of the things that we also want to do is have more editors of color, more queer editors, more agents who are people of color who are underrepresented in the ecosystem today. And could you talk also just about how important it is to help create a world? It's the same thing. Yes to barring the door, yes to going through, no one's going to stop me, but also now that I have, hey, come on with me. We want to encourage people to also recognize the power of being connected to the book world while you're working on being a writer. Yeah.
So I can start. Sometimes working these jobs actually doesn't benefit you as an artist. So for instance, when I was at the Loft, I was very careful to be, when I was at my capacity at the Loft, to be an arts administrator. Some of the artists that I brought in didn't even know I was the same Bao Phi that had written some of these books, because, you know, like it's unprofessional for me to be kind of like, hey, by the way, I've written this book. You know what I mean? Like, so I was always very careful. So there's not necessarily, and now that I work at McKnight, I can't apply obviously for any McKnight arts funding, which is the biggest arts funding in the state, right? So it's not like you actually have material benefits that way, actually working the benefit. It actually is probably going to work against you. But I think one thing that's valuable is that you are part of these conversations in a way that can be very invigorating. You know what I mean? So I don't know if you would really go into one of these careers to further your own career. We were just talking about it. In fact, if you go into one of these careers in the arts, you're probably sacrificing who you are as an artist to a certain extent, right? Because there has to be a distance. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You just have to figure out a different way. You know what I mean? I don't know if I almost like tell folks, double major in creative writing and computer science so that you have a job, right? You can get paid and you can still be an artist. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It's your answer. Yeah.
Okay.
That's such a complicated question, because you can't, capitalism ruins everything. Let's just start there. But I think that there's this kind of mystique associated with, you're only a famous writer if you have a tenure track job, which is absolutely not true. Again, that's something that's happened in the last, basically in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. And the fact is probably that, academia can be soul crushing for one, but it also is kind of infects every part of your life too. And again, you could get a job and that's your job, and then you go home and you're a writer and that's your other job. And I had likened it to like waiting tables. I loved waiting tables, because waiting tables, you were crazy, you did the stuff, and then you walked out the door and you were done. And academia is not like that. And a lot of these types of jobs are not like that. So if you're the type of person who can organize their life and say, I'm going to get my paycheck, and then I'm going to go home and be an artist, and never the twain shall meet, I think that's absolutely an option. Yeah. It doesn't make you less of an artist. I think culturally we've created that, but it's because we've created this capitalistic hierarchical model of what it means to be an artist. Zadie Smith wrote her first novel when she's 21 years old. She didn't need an MFA to do that. She just put in the time. But the one thing I would say is that having been an editor as long as I have, which is over 20 years, made me an infinitely better writer. Yeah. And there are so many ways in which you can do that work. You don't have to, start your own press, although you can start your own press. Mm-hmm. I can definitely talk to you about how easy that can be and how important an activist that can be. is being in collaboration, being in community. It doesn't have to be in an MFA classroom. It's just constantly interrogating the work and learning how to articulate what someone else's work is doing and not doing and what its possibility is. And so while my work, while I didn't have a book for 12 years, what I was doing was in conversation with these authors who they were allowing me the privilege and the gift of coming into their work, was I was learning how to talk about literature and learning how to bring those tools into my work. And so in a way, what I'm suggesting is that anything that you do in the world, any job that you can do can in one way or another inform your art if you shape your life that way.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking about this on the way here, the different ways, because I feel like not everyone has the temperament to be an arts administrator. Not everyone has the temperament to be a teacher.
Yes.
Not every writer is going to be a good teacher or an arts admin or even editor, So I was thinking about, you have these like non-academic literature houses like The Loft or like Hugo House in Seattle, places like this. And I just think about like, what are the different needs they might have that other younger writers or people who haven't been like entrenched in some of these institutions, skills that might be needed. So I was thinking like, what if somebody who was at a community college and they got like an early childhood education certificate or something, had a daycare for writers that were parents at that house or something. Like there are so many not catering, but like something like that, like providing food for people. And I think that there is a lot of not every job was just like given from the heavens and has been there for eternity. Like who was the first social media manager of a editor or of a press or something? Like someone had to come up with that job idea. Like someone had to come up with that. So I just think about that and the different skills people who are getting their degrees and are thinking, I don't think I can make it work as a writer solely. I need to do something else. I think there are a lot of ways to incorporate that into especially these like literary houses like The Loft and such. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But it's one of those things again where it can be kind of stressful, but it's the thing that you have to make. You're going to make it happen.
Thank you.
I just thought of something.
Yeah.
I just thought of something really quick, some practical advice. When and if you start applying for grants and fellowships and that type of thing, if you ever are offered the opportunity to actually be a panelist or a jury on a grant, take it. Even if the pay is kind of poopy.
It is.
Or whatnot, because what happens is you gain experience on knowing what it's like to be on the other side of that, reading through like anywhere from 100 to 1,000 creative writing applications. You start to get a sense of like, oh, if I write a grant, how can I kind of be concise in presenting myself in a way that's gonna, catch the tired eyeballs of someone who is doing this.
Yeah.
It's one of the most, I recommend it highly if you ever get a chance to sit on a panel and jury, do it at least once so that you get the experience, and it'll make you a better grant, it'll sharpen your ability to represent yourself.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Amy, I just want to do a quick time check. I know we started a little bit later. Are we okay for? Thank you. One theme that's been radiating through our conversation today is community, and all the ways that we as artists benefit from being in close company with other people, working on projects together, being inspired by the things that they're doing. I wondered if you could talk also just about, just directly about how community with other people who are going through the same things. I was also kind of thinking about, you finish your MFA from a marquee institution, you're on a 12-year path, and somebody in your cohort got a book done right away, and you have to block that part out. But you're.
Where are you now?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and there is no timeline. It's ready when it's ready. And I also, by the way, really connected to your idea that it can make more sense to focus on craft and voice and growing as an artist, and then kind of but I have benefited so much from being in community with other artists. And I wonder if you could all just talk a little bit about that. Halee, I'll start with you.
So the community that comes in mind that I'm a part of that has been really just incredible is called INAPO, Indigenous Nations Poets, which is a new sort of poetry fellowship cohort organization that's kind of like the indigenous answer to like Kundiman or Kavikanem. There was never anything like that for indigenous writers until like 2 years ago. And we had our first like fellow retreat last year in Washington, D.C., and it was extremely transformative to be in a room of people to whom you didn't have to describe like your entire like history, dating like pre-contact with settlers and stuff, to be able to not have to talk about that. And we're just like, okay, we understand indigeneity looks so many different ways. I might not know everything about your nation, but like we know we have a base level, like we don't have to talk about some of this stuff. And then actually being able to get to the work and make advances in a way that I have not really had in a poetry workshop that there was maybe one other Native person in, probably not. So that community is absolutely transformative. So I would recommend, I know that it's hard but I don't think that there's not community out there for everybody, but to find something where you feel like you don't have to explain something that gets in the way of your actual work.
Yeah, thank you.
So I was actually talking to my daughter yesterday about romanticism and about romantic poets, and as we're talking about it, it reminds me that we experience artists in isolation. We read their work and we think, oh, this is a singular work, but we don't realize that first of all, they're standing on the shoulders of every person that they read, even the one that they read the one poem and they thought it was really good. But that also, even if it's not named, everyone is coming out of a community. Someone, a book is an object that a lot of people have laid their hands on and have touched in some way or another and changed. And so that's why it's really vital to find a community. And that the way that you participate in a community isn't just reading each other's poems. It's like, I'm going to make a chapbook for you because I love you and I think you're brilliant, and we're going to take it and you're going to do your reading and I'm going to share it with you. Because it's also just, I think there's something spiritual about connecting with other people's works, or I'm going to organize a reading and we're going to talk about this, or I'm going to get people on a Zoom and we're just going to read each other poems. Any way in which you're constantly cultivating, because what happens, I mean, you can just sort of look at any kind of like important cultural, movement, and I'm not going to get super academic-y, which I could, is just to think about the ways, I will, just a little bit, is just to think about, for example, the way in which surrealism came into the United States through exiles who came into New York. And in New York, they catalyzed these enormous forces that created abstract expressionism and the New York School of Poets, which also just had this enormous influence. And they're just a bunch of people hanging around, loving art, talking about art, and not just engaging with their own art, talking to painters, talking to musicians, collaborating with each other. Because that's the other thing, we get a little bit siloed in our art, but when we open ourselves and understand that we might listen to a beautiful piece of music and open ourselves to defining how that music is changing music and think, I wonder if I applied that same idea of changing music to changing what language does, that's community, that's opening yourself up. And in a way, that's a more spiritual thing, but it's exactly what happens when you're in a room and you hear something and it's not what you would go to in the first place, but it changes who you are.
I agree with all of that. I think to add to it, I want to be very careful about how I'm going to say this. Community is great, and be ready for everyone's humanity. So I've talked to other people too, and not even just artists, but like people from historically marginalized communities, people of color. Let's say like you're like the weird Vietnamese guy, right, who writes poetry, and you feel alienated all your life, and then you finally find your people, right, and you have these expectations or this vision of them because you need them so badly, right? Because you've been without them for so long. And then you're in community with them and they are human, and we let each other down, and we hurt each other, or we disagree. And there are times when I've found myself in those situations not being reasonable, or not, you know what I mean? Like that I am holding community up to standards that perhaps are shaped more about my baggage than, and I want to be very careful because I'm not insinuating that any of us should put up with harm. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that anytime you put a couple of different people in a room together and call it community or whatever, yes, it is joyful, it is beautiful, but it's also messy and it's really hard, and like temper your expectations maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
I've found it can take some time to find your community.
yeah.
And that people you wouldn't necessarily expect to be your kin in the world of arts sometimes are.
Or sometimes you outgrow one another.
That happens too.
And that happens, and that's okay. You
Yep.
know, like, yeah, definitely.
As we close, I'd just love to know what you're all thinking about right now and working on. I don't want to turn this into what's next, like what's the next book. But if you have something like that you want to talk about, that's great. But I wonder if there are questions or projects connected to art making, to the literary world, either at your writing desk or elsewhere that have your attention in this moment.
So with my Jerome grant, I'm kind of looking at a long-term project that involves a road trip. And I'm going to hopefully be writing a hybrid travel memoir tracing the Ojibwe migration path all around the Great Lakes up into the beginning of the St. Lawrence River where we originated. And along the way, I hope to interview different Native elders and youth and people who are doing important things. So it's the biggest hurdle for me though is I have to get a driver's license. And I'm that's that type of practical thing why I'm not an arts administrator is I'm how am I going to do this? I can write the book. Can I get the driver's license? We will see.
Let's talk about that. I have an idea for you.
I'm finishing a translation project that I'm very excited, a Peruvian poet, so that feels good. Right, I have this amazing job, and I'm throwing my creativity in it. I did a panel a few weeks ago, and this young woman came up to me and said, I just want to thank you just for being in this position as a Latinx woman. And that I was yes, I'm doing this for a lot of reasons, but that is a really important reason for me, because I had I only had to teach one class a semester, I have a 40-hour, but it's fine because it just kind of feels better because what I want to do is really change. I'm the only woman of color who runs a press of this size in the country. Well, thank you. But I think it's a call to action, right? Why? And what is it that I can do in this position, and how could I use this cultural capital that Grey Wolf has and share it with other folks and then bring it into the community? Right. That really is where I'm throwing in my creative work. That's the best creative work that I can be doing right now.
Two quick things. So on the worky work side, I'm part of a team that is asking, what would it look like if we funded artists who have social justice as a part of their practice? And that initiative was started before I was even hired, but I'm part of a team of continuing to ask that question after talking to artists in the community. I'm part of the question, what would that look like? So I'm a part of that team at work. So that's one thing that's exciting. In terms of outside of the office, I'm one of the co-editors of an upcoming Asian American Pacific Islander diasporic anthology of poets from the oral tradition. So it's very exciting, very daunting. There's going to be about 100 different poets represented into it. We've been working on it for years, and we're the finish line is within sight, but it's,
Yeah.
you all know,
Yeah.
all know.
Will there be an audio component also?
That's a great question. I don't know.
Okay.
Probably not, because it's Haymarket. Great press, but it's not
Yeah.
one of the major,
Right.
people who print
Halee,
money.
Carmen, Bao, thank you all so much for your time and ideas. Can we just give them a round of applause? And can we thank again our partners at Thomson Reuters and the Minnesota Multi-State Campus Collaboration also for helping make this possible. A couple of closing things, also kind of along the housekeeping lines. There are snacks, and we need your help. We don't want to carry these home, so do your part, okay? The other thing is we will ask you, and I think for the folks online as well, to complete a survey about this symposium. That helps us in a couple ways. It validates this program. It helps us demonstrate the value of these conversations. And as we look toward the future, it helps us kind of make the future conversations better. So I'm grateful to all of you for being here with us and your patience with us at the outset. And the round of introductions we almost got through. Let's keep it going out here in the lobby. And thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.